there even morality related to vaccines? How is morality even playing a role in vaccines? So yeah, to talk more about this, we have Nikhil. So for those who don't know Nikhil, I'll give us very short introduction. So Nikhil, he's a doctor first of all, and second, he lives in Cork. At the moment, that's like in the south side of Ireland. So yes, and how long you been a doctor for now, Nikhil?
three,
Almost 3 years,
3 years.
right? Yeah, 3 years. So, and he's currently a doctor in, I forgot, you moved, which hospital are you in at the moment?
Um, Cork, Mercy.
Cork, Cork University Hospital, yes. He's been moving around here and there in different hospitals because he's a very busy doctor. So, now to talk more about the topic and to talk more about Nikhil as well, I'm handing over to Nikhil. So, yeah, please do.
Thank you, guys. Can you see me?
Yes.
And you can see the.
Yeah, we can see the screen at the moment saying thoughts question mark.
Yeah. A friend of mine has very kindly reminded me, firstly, are you a doctor or are you a son of God? Firstly, I'm a son of God. Thank you very much, Roshan, for the introduction. But I think um, we won't be focusing so much on the science of the vaccine today because there's lots you can read about it. And while that is important, that's another aspect. We're going to be dealing with an aspect that maybe you will not find much of in secular media. So you can see the slides and you can see me and you can hear me. Yes?
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, great. So, um, because it's such a topical issue, I just thought we'd spend about 20 minutes or so, 20, 25 minutes, just talking about this vaccine and why some people might have an objection to it. And then at the end, hopefully, we can have a bit of back and forth, maybe a bit of Q&A and stuff for about 5-10 minutes at the end. So, as we know, none of us need an introduction on what's going on with the whole COVID thing. It's a pandemic. Cases are on the rise again. It's causing us to going into social distancing and restrictions in terms of our movements and things. And uh, a vaccine for this COVID-19 virus has been eagerly awaited for a long time as maybe the thing that'll help us contain this virus, this pandemic. And yet, now in recent months that vaccines have come out, a lot of people have concerns about the vaccine, certain moral objections to the vaccine. So that's what we're going to be examining today. What we won't be looking at is things like the safety data or the efficacy data. So I won't be going into the medical side of things or the scientific side of things. We can maybe bring that up later on in the Q&A, and we've got a couple of pharmacists around as well who can help us with that. What we'll be interested in today is the morality behind the vaccine. Is there any objection to it? So before we dive into that, I think it's pertinent to maybe take a step back and look at what vaccines are and how vaccines work. So vaccines train your body to fight germs faster. So when you get a disease, what happens is the virus or a bacterium, any kind of disease, infectious disease, it invades your body, it comes in, and then your body's alerted, oh, there's something foreign in my body. I need to mount an immune response against it. So your immune system goes into hyperdrive. It starts producing all these immune cells, starts recruiting the troops to fight off this infection, this virus that has invaded you. And that takes time. And in the time that it takes between the virus affecting your body, invading your body, and the time it takes your immune system to build up that response and to fight it off, any symptoms and things that you get, that's basically the disease that you have. So what we try and do with the vaccine, the purpose of a vaccine, is to try and reduce that time from when you first get infected with the virus to the time your body starts fighting it off, because that usually takes a time to develop, right? So how we usually, traditionally, how we reduce that time is by introducing a vaccine that contains a weakened version of the virus or the bacteria, if it's a bacterial vaccine. So what that does is it introduces a weakened version, so your body still recognizes as something foreign, and it starts producing all the immune cells and recruiting all the foot soldiers and stuff. So that later on in the future, if you do encounter that virus, the actual virus, not the vaccine, you're ready. Your immune system has all the foot soldiers, it needs all the artillery, everyone's ready to just go, go, go. And that time is reduced, which means that by the time you're infected, your immune system is ready to fight it off. You don't really get the disease, you don't get the symptoms because your immune system has already started working at it. So that's how traditionally vaccines work. And I know that there are these new mRNA vaccines, new DNA vaccines, some viral vector vaccines. There's all different kind of science to it. We won't go into that, but suffice to say that in the production of these vaccines, sometimes you have to use cells. And the cells are used because if you're using viruses, um, like weakened version of the viruses and vaccinating it into people, you somehow need to make a lot of copies of the virus because there's a lot of people to be vaccinated. And how you do that is by using cells to replicate these viruses. Now, these cells can come from a whole host of sources. It can come from monkeys, it can come from hamsters, it can come from eggs, and also it can come from humans. And in some cases, it can come from a problematic source, which is precisely the moral objection that a lot of people have to this. So as you can see, you can probably see here, this is a fetus, a human fetus, a baby, and tissue from its kidney is taken, and that human cell is then replicated. Then you get a fetal cell line. So you have that one cell from the fetus, and you've got a whole cell line. And then copies of that are made, and copies of copies are made, and copies of copies of copies are made. So um, these copies exist in different research laboratories around the world. So when they're developing a new vaccine, they use this to replicate the virus that they're trying to make the vaccine for. Don't worry if you don't understand, if there's anything that I'm maybe not conveying clearly. All you have to know is that cells are used in the production of the vaccine, and that's precisely the human cell use, especially from aborted fetuses, is the moral objection that a lot of people have to this. The moral question is it a vaccine of illicit origin? And I don't think there is any argument that some of the vaccines that are available for COVID-19 are of illicit origin. Illicit meaning unlawful or immoral. So some of the vaccines that are used, that are being offered to us for COVID-19, use in some part of their process cells that come from a line of cells. So remember, we have this whole line of cells, and this line of cells can be traced back to two fetuses, two babies that were aborted in the 1960s and 70s. And the objection, obviously, then that people have to it is that by receiving that vaccine, which has an immoral or an illicit origin, I am cooperating with that initial evil of abortion, or that I am setting a bad example, or I'm being part of that culture of death that abortion is part of. And this is a real stumbling block for a lot of Catholics and even pro-lifers, who, people who believe in the sanctity of life and uphold the dignity of the human person. That's a real stumbling block. How can I receive a vaccine that employs cell lines from an aborted fetus? So how do we approach this situation? What has the church said? Has the church said anything about it, and what is it? So before we look, and if in a few slides time we're going to look at what the church has said about this situation, I think it's important to familiarize ourselves with a couple of terms that we're going to encounter. So we're going to have Model Theology 101. So these, just to learn a couple of definitions, and these definitions will relate to cooperation with evil. So let's say if I'm doing a particular act, I want to know, am I somehow cooperating with some evil act that has happened or that's about to happen? And that's what cooperation with evil means. Now, let's look at a couple of examples to kind of maybe make that a bit more concrete. Let's say if you're bringing a friend, someone who's going to have an abortion, and you're bringing them to an abortion clinic to have an abortion. There, and let's say you intend that they have that abortion, and you approve, that you think that, oh, this is okay, like this is what's required here, you should get that abortion. If you intend or approve of that evil act that's taking place, that's called formal cooperation. So you're formally cooperating with the evil. I know what's going to happen, I approve of it, I intend it. That's formal cooperation. But what if you don't intend the evil that's happening? What if you don't approve of the evil, but you're just somehow involved in that? You're just somehow either providing the means for it, or you're facilitating a situation where that evil takes place, but you don't intend it, or you don't approve of it, but you're somehow linked to it. That's called material cooperation. An example of material cooperation would be, let's say, for example, um, let's say a guy in a pub is getting drunk, and he's in a state of drunkenness, which obviously is a vice. It's not a good thing. And let's think back to the guy who drove the Budweiser truck that brought the beer that ultimately led to this guy getting drunk. You can see that somehow this guy is a link in that chain of events that caused this guy to sin, to enter drunkenness. But you can see that this guy maybe didn't necessarily approve of or intend of this drunkenness, this evil, the guy driving the Budweiser truck. But he's somehow still linked. That kind of a cooperation with evil is called material cooperation, where you don't intend or approve of it, but somehow you're providing the means and the materials or the circumstance, or somehow you're linked to that evil. So, material cooperation with evil can itself be in varying degrees. Let's take the example of the abortion clinic. That, let's say, young woman is going to get an abortion. You can see that the nurse handing the surgical instruments to the abortionist who's performing it has a certain cooperation with that evil of abortion. And let's say the bus driver who drives the bus on the route that services the abortion clinic, knowing that some of the people getting on his bus are probably going to the abortion clinic to have an abortion. And let's say this young woman who's going for the abortion came on that bus. You can see how that guy who drove the bus also has some kind of a cooperation with that evil. But you can see that that nurse has a much closer link or cooperation with the abortion than the guy who's driving the bus. You know, that the guy who's driving the bus has a much more distant link with the act of abortion. Or let's say in the case of the guy who's engaging in drunkenness in the pub, the guy, let's say you're a bartender and you see that this guy is maybe borderline drunk or he's already drunk, and you hand him another drink. You are cooperating in that evil to a certain extent, even though you're obviously not the one doing it. But you can see that that guy, the bartender handing him the drink, has a much closer link to the evil of drunkenness than the guy who drove the Budweiser truck or the Carlsberg truck or whatever, who drove the truck that brought the crates of beer, or even the guy at the back of the bar who stacked the bottles up there. You can see that the bartender has a closer link, and slightly more distant is the guy at the back of the bar who's stacking it, and even more distant is the guy who drove the Budweiser truck. So you can see in terms of material cooperation with the evil, there can be varying degrees of closeness or varying degrees of moral responsibility. So the nurse handing the instruments would have a greater moral responsibility because she's more closely linked. And let's say the guy driving the truck or the bus has a more distant link. And therein come the terms proximate versus remote. When you have a close association with the evil that's happening, that's called proximate material cooperation. Proximate meaning close, like the closest star to the earth is called Proxima Centauri, Proxima, close. And remote is when it's distant, like the bus driver or the Budweiser truck driver, who has a distant link. Remote as in, like a remote control. I can control my TV from a distance, remote. So remember this term, Even if you don't remember the other stuff, remember that you can have remote cooperation with evil. And remote cooperation is something that happens in our life on a daily basis. On a daily basis, we cooperate um, um, in some way or another, and it's because we live in a broken world that has many evils in it. It's practically impossible to avoid some level of remote cooperation with evil. For example, let's say if I tip 15 euros to a pizza delivery guy, that guy takes that money home and he gives it to his son. And the son uses that 15 euros to either consume pornography or buy drugs or something like that. You can see that I am somehow a link in that chain of events, and I am somehow cooperating in that evil, but I didn't intend it. You can see that it's such so distant, so remote. I can't not tip that guy, you know. Or for example, if I am shopping at Tesco, for example, and Tesco, for argument's sake, supports or funds or contributes to an organization that supports abortion, let's say, like Planned Parenthood or something, we'd be paralyzed on a daily basis in our decision making if we start and sit down and research every single possible remote cooperation with evil I have probably ever had. So it's clear that some level of remote cooperation with evil is morally permissible while looking at other factors. And that's because we live in a broken world. So, where does that leave us? Coming back to the issue at hand of vaccines, what has the church taught? So, the church in December 2020 issued the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith issued a statement on this, and that statement contains 6 points. And I'm going to be paraphrasing the five of the 6 points which are most relevant to us here. A lot can be said about this, and 25 minutes isn't enough time. So hopefully we can discuss some of the things later on in the Q&A session. But I'm just going to take us through the 5 points that the church has said about this. Number one, there are differing degrees of responsibility between the people who decide to use the fetal cells in making the vaccines versus those who have no voice in it. Now, what does that mean? Um, it means that people who are more closely linked, for example, the researchers and the scientists who decided first to use the fetal cell lines, or the pharmaceutical companies who conducted that research, they would have, you can appreciate, a greater degree of responsibility than people down the line. For example, the person at the end of the line, the guy receiving the vaccine. It's one thing to remember. Number two, and this is probably the most important point, when ethically acceptable, this is paraphrased, right? This is not verbatim quotes. I'm paraphrasing what the second point is. When ethically acceptable COVID-19 vaccines are not available, for example, in countries where vaccines without ethical problems are not made available, or distribution is difficult because they don't have the ability to do cold storage, or for whatever reason, if ethically acceptable COVID vaccines that do not use any aborted cell lines at all, if they're not available, in the face of grave danger, which the pandemic seems to pose to us, it is morally acceptable to receive the COVID-19 vaccines that have used cell lines from aborted fetuses in their research and production process. And this statement is what has been reassuring to a lot of people who were looking to the church for guidance on it, and has been problematic for a lot of people who say that I don't want anything to do with an aborted cell line. Just to reiterate that second point again, when ethically acceptable vaccines, COVID-19 vaccines, are not available in the face of grave danger, it is morally acceptable to receive COVID-19 vaccines that have used the cell lines from aborted babies. Now, the third point that the church makes is the reason for saying that is that for the people receiving the vaccine, their cooperation with the evil of the initial abortion. We have to remember that there are no abortions taking place now. The abortions took place in 1970 for a different reason, and the cell lines that are used now are copies of copies of copies of copies of copies that are derived from the original abortion that took place in the 1960s and 1970s. So it is clear that both in terms of how long it has been, and also in terms of how many steps has happened in the process, you can see that our association with that initial evil of abortion is quite remote. And that is the reason that it is morally permissible to receive that vaccine, because our cooperation with that evil is quite remote. And considering that there's grave danger from the COVID-19 disease, the moral duty to avoid this evil, this remote material cooperation with evil, is not obligatory. Meaning, it's not obligatory that you have to avoid this remote cooperation with evil at all costs. That it is permissible to get the vaccine. Now, the next point that the church makes is that just because it's morally permissible does not mean, I think, let me see if I can quote it. I think it says, does not and should not imply that the use of aborted fetal cell lines is acceptable. This is not the church going another step closer to saying that, oh, it's fine to use aborted cell lines. No, that is, not only is it not ideal, it is wrong, and we shouldn't. And nor is this in any way an endorsement of abortion or using um, uh, in an undignified way a person as a commodity to do research. So that is a careful distinction that needs to be made in our heads, and it's important to remember that anybody who receives this vaccine, um, like a Catholic or a pro-life person, anyone who receives the vaccine does so under protest, that they take steps to make their protest known, make their voice heard, that I do not approve of this. So obviously, at the moment, these vaccines are in circulation and it's already out there. But even a few months back, when these vaccines were in development, Catholics and other pro-life people were out there lobbying governments and lobbying pharmaceutical companies, writing to them and putting pressure on them and saying that we do not want ethically compromised or morally compromised vaccines. So putting pressure on them, that is the right thing to do, to look for alternatives. This is only saying that in the face of grave danger, in the absence of alternatives, it's morally permissible. But that's in no way an endorsement of abortion or the use of aborted cell lines in vaccine making. And the last point is that this vaccination is not mandatory, meaning that if people, because of reasons of conscience, they say, look, I don't want anything to do with this vaccine. It has, no matter how remote the cooperation with evil and whatever you want to say to me, look, I don't want to take it. That's fine. Because the vaccination is not mandatory, and those who refuse the vaccine for reasons of conscience, are, it's okay to do so. So what the church is doing there is protecting people's right to object on conscientious grounds. So for example, let's say if you live in a dictatorship somewhere where they make the vaccine mandatory and they say you have to receive it, um, a Catholic is within their rights to say that, no, I'm a Catholic, and the church has officially released a statement saying that on conscientious grounds, if I don't want to receive the vaccine, I don't have to receive the vaccine. But the church reminds us that if you do choose not to take the vaccine, you must still do your best to protect those who are most at risk from the disease. So, be it by taking steps to ensure that you don't pass on uh, the uh, the virus to another person, or whatever steps you do, social distancing, or whatever measures, that it's not just a case of kind of virtue signaling. I'm sure you understand what virtue signaling is. It'd be like saying, oh, I personally would do, kind of being self-righteous about it. That make sure you're doing it with integrity. If you decide not to take the vaccine, that you're doing it with moral integrity, and you still take steps to measure, to ensure that you're not posing a risk to other people. Now, coming back to the vaccines, coming into the practical things about it, the vaccines are largely divided. You can divide them into three categories. Those that do not use abortion-derived cell lines in any phase, so they are obviously the ideal. They're not ethically compromised. We'd have no problem or objection taking them. Number two are the types of vaccines that um, do not use the abortion cell lines in the manufacturing phase. So when they're making the vaccines, they don't use any compromised cell lines. But at some other stage in their development, for example, in their testing phase, they do use it. So you have to remember that there are 20 plus different brands of vaccines that are in varying stage of research and development around the world. It's not just the one or two that we often hear about in news. So these 20 plus vaccines are the ones we're talking about, that you can divide into these three categories. Number one, nothing to do with the aborted cell lines. Number two, use the cell lines not in manufacturing, but maybe in like a testing phase. And number three are those that do use abortion derived cell lines in more than one phase of development, especially in manufacturing, i.e., their vaccines are um, uh, made of aborted cell lines, made of cells that are derived from the aborted cell line. So obviously, you can see that the ideal one would be a vaccine that is in category one, that has nothing to do with abortion. Uh, a step back from that would be um, ones that use it, maybe in a testing phase, but haven't used it in the making of the vaccine. And number three would be the least desirable candidate of all of these. But reflecting on what the church has said, if categories one and two are not available in the face of grave danger, it is morally permissible to take even a category three vaccine. Now, these are, as I said, there are 20 plus vaccines available. On the left, you can see the various brands of the vaccine. Um, and on the right, actually at the bottom, there's a key to how the symbols work. You can see here, this means it does not use the aborted cell, abortion derived cell line in its development stage. And here it says that some tests use it in the testing phase. Now I'll explain, clarify. Sorry, that was a bit confusing. I'll clarify it a bit more. So these three are the ones that we're going to be looking at from the Irish/European context, because in the near future, these are the ones that we're going to be encountering. So the top one, the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine, is the one that has been in circulation and people have been receiving in Ireland for the last couple of weeks. This one, this is an mRNA vaccine. Basically, it does not require the use of any kind of cell in its development. It's machine. It's synthesized in a laboratory, and it doesn't require any cell lines. So it hasn't used the abortion cell lines in its development of the vaccine. But in a testing phase, to see if the vaccine is working, what dose do we need to make it at, is it stable, blah blah blah. In the testing phase, they've used cell lines that are derived from these two aborted fetuses from the 1960s and 70s. So you can see that's a category 2 kind of vaccine. The second one is the Moderna vaccine, which has been approved by the European Medicines Agency, and the first batches of which arrived to Ireland only yesterday. So they haven't gone into circulation yet, as far as I understand. They only arrived yesterday, but we will be seeing them coming more and more into circulation. And this one, similar to the Pfizer BioNTech one, is an mRNA vaccine, so does not use any cells, so does not use the abortion cells in its manufacturing. So none of the original cells or any kind of cells are present in this vaccine. But similar to the Pfizer one, in its testing phase, in the later phases, it used some of these abortion-derived cell lines to test out their vaccine. So again, that's a category 2 kind of vaccine. The last one is the AstraZeneca vaccine. AstraZeneca is a pharmaceutical company, and they have collaborated with Oxford University in the UK. And as far as I understand, they've applied for approval from the European Medicines Agency, but they're still waiting. They haven't got that approval yet. And this vaccine, should it ever come to Ireland, and I'm sure at some stage they will try and bring it to Ireland, it does use in its production. It's not an mRNA vaccine, it's a different kind of, I think it's a DNA vaccine or a viral vector vaccine or something. In its production phase, as well as the testing phase, it uses abortion-derived cell lines. So that's a category 3 and the least desirable of these three. And you can see there are other vaccines like the Johnson & Johnson ones, which is also similar. It's a category 3 kind of vaccine. So the ones that that has been in Ireland in circulation the last couple of weeks is the Pfizer BioNTech one, which does not use abortion-derived cell lines in its production or manufacture, but has used it in testing. Now, take-home points. The church teaches that in the absence of ethically accepted alternatives, let's say, for example, let's say a month from now, all of these vaccines are available. Oh, actually, okay, this isn't good. Sorry, there are other vaccines, like I can't remember, the one that's being made in India, and there are others in Europe as well that have a green here and a green here, in that they've nothing to do with an abortion cell line, which is a category 1. If you have the choice between that kind of a vaccine and one that even in a remote way has something to do with the abortion, obviously this is the one you should go for. But in the absence of ethically accepted alternatives, given that there is a grave danger, since our cooperation with the initial abortion is so remote, so distant, the church teaches that it is morally acceptable to receive the COVID-19 vaccines that have used cell lines from aborted fetuses. But but it also tells us that it's not obligatory. So if you say, look, I understand what you're saying, I'm hearing what you're saying, I want nothing to do with this. I heard the word abortion, even in a remote way, I don't want to be related to it. I don't want to take it. That's fine. It's not obligatory. And you can object on conscientious grounds. And we are encouraged to live a culture of life, not a culture of death. And this is in no way an endorsement of abortion or the use of abortion cell lines in research. And we should always encourage and put pressure on pharmaceutical companies and researchers and governments to seek out ethical alternatives, and never are we endorsing the evil of abortion. These are just take-home points, guys. I know there's a lot of stuff. Hopefully we can bring up some more stuff in Q&A. There's a lot that we can dive into deeper here. So I've got a list of things that, if you want to look at the moral side of things, or whether you want to look at some of the sciencey bits, like what are mRNA vaccines, how do they work, am I going to grow an extra nose or an ear because it's going to alter my DNA, or whatever questions you might have, there's more resources on that. So that's it from me. If people have any questions, as I said, we've got a couple of pharmacists, and I'm sure there are other people who've read up on this stuff, and we can have a bit of a discussion.
Have you taken it, Nikhil?
Well, yeah, we can have questions for the floor, right? And
yeah,
I don't necessarily have to take questions, but if I know something, I can.
No. Have you taken the vaccine?
Oh, have I taken the vaccine? Yeah. I took it last week.
Yeah, so guys, yes, the floor is open for questions, and we'll do our best in answering them. We can't guarantee that we'll be able to answer every single question, but we'll do our best in answering them. So yeah, if you have any questions,
I have a question.
yeah.
So I just want to, I don't know if I misheard it. It was, did you mention there are vaccines that currently don't use aborted fetuses at any stage?
There are vaccines in the pipeline.
Right.
So worldwide, there have only been 3 vaccines that have been approved or are very close to being approved. These are the top 3 that we saw: the Pfizer BioNTech one, the Moderna one, and the AstraZeneca one hasn't been approved yet in Europe, but they've just applied for approval.
But they still use it at testing stages, is it?
Sorry?
But they still may or sometimes use it in testing stages.
Who? Sorry.
Like the AstraZeneca and Pfizer and Moderna.
So no ethically acceptable vaccines are available at present.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
No. So the question was just more like, well, the question was going to be: is there likely going to be any vaccines that don't have any involvement with aborted fetuses? Because, well, I'd also like to know what. Well, I'm pretty sure I don't know if it's needed to have the stem cells from the fetuses, or if that's why they use it, or if it's able to derive, or if they're able to derive the stem cells from another part of the body, like bone marrow or something, not from fetuses.
Yeah, you can use lung fibroblasts, you can use skin, you can use it. It doesn't even have to be humans. Like a lot of the other ones are using Vero monkey cells or hamster cells, and they are in the pipeline. But it's all about who can get there in the middle of the pandemic. Which one of the vaccines can get there now in the middle of the pandemic. So the question isn't what will I do, because like if I wait maybe like 10 months or something, maybe this question isn't going to be that relevant, because this is in the face of grave danger. So these things apply in the here and now that we're in the pandemic. So if at the moment we had those vaccines, then obviously that's what we'd be pushing for. But let's say if that vaccine was only available in Europe and you lived in Asia, so then the church's teaching there would be applicable to you.
Okay.
Is there any reason why fetal cell lines are being used? Why specifically fetal cell lines are being used?
So it's about mass production. You need the viral copies, and you need a lot of them. So you need cells that can divide quickly. So why fetal cells are used, I presume the main reason is because they were there. So copies were made from this aborted fetus in the 1960s, and it's like photocopying something. You photocopy something, then you throw away the original, somebody photocopies that photocopy, someone photocopies the copy of the copy, likewise. And these exist in laboratories around the world. So when they want to experiment, it's right there, so they use it. Why they use it, I think there's something to do with the number. There's only so many times a cell can divide. There's a limit called the Hayflick limit to it, and maybe fetal cells divide just much better or whatever. I don't know the minutiae of it, but I'm sure it's simply, at the end of it, it's just because they're there, and most people don't have an objection to it, so they just use it. It's not just the first vaccine using fetal cells. Rabies, hepatitis A, rubella, chickenpox, a lot of vaccines have employed this in the past, and the church has spoken about it in the past as well.
Just wondering, okay, I don't know if this is right to do or not, but if it's specifically because fetal cell lines, kind of can multiply multiple times without having a stop to it, and they have like loads of cells ready for testing and everything, just like we, like as a fully grown human beings, adults, we kind of give our cells we give our organs or whatever for any kind of tests and everything after death. I'm not saying that's equal to abortion, but what I'm asking is, like, if, for example, could you not take a cell from a from a newborn baby? Would that not suffice as like a fetal cell line too? Because it's just a baby inside, it just came outside.
Yeah, so a lot of to do with the cell lines is just pure chance. So some of the cell lines that they use are called immortal cell lines, as in they seem to have exceeded this limit, and they just keep dividing and dividing and dividing, and there's no issue. So they're like immortal cell lines. They're like copies of copies of copies. This has been happening for so long. So it's hard to come across and to happen upon an immortal cell line. And one of the immortal cell lines that exists in research laboratories around the world is the cell from the HEK, human embryonic kidney 293, as it's called, which came from the original abortion. So it's hard to come across. So if you take, this is my bare understanding of it from what little I've read, is that if you take one now, that may not be an immortal cell line. Say, like, if you're manufacturing, mass producing vaccines, and this cell stops replicating after 50 divisions, well, you need more than 50 vaccines. Whereas if you've got an immortal cell line already there, and you don't see anything wrong with it, obviously you would use that, right? So that's presumably why they use it.
I have another question just based on that, because you mentioned all of these vaccines are using abortions from the 60s and 70s or around that time. So is it like all those couple of abortions that like those cells have just been used for all these companies, and they've just been, or is it like each company has different? I don't know. I don't know exactly how it works, because I remember reading with
there were 2 abortions that took place, and some scientist or doctor somewhere isolated cells from these two aborted babies, and they've got their own code names. I think one is called the HEK239 and another one is called something something numbers and letters. And these they have made copies of. They've taken that one cell and made copies of that. And that copy, somebody else took a copy of that and they made cell lines from that. And they've had an immortal kind of derived from the original couple of cells or few cells or one cell or whatever that they took. They've had so many loads and loads of copies of this. So it's not that abortions are still being done, or it's not that a load of abortions were done during the 1960s. Two abortions were done, and some people took cells out of those two, and copies of those haven't been made, and they exist in laboratories around the world. And people use this for vaccine development or testing or technology. It's not the first time they've come to the fore. The church has spoken on this previously in the face of like polio or rubella or hepatitis A and things like that.
That makes sense. No, it was just I had read. I think it was the company that made the antibody cocktails. So I read they had one from the 80s. So I was like, do all these companies just have cells from all these different, babies from different times? So I don't know if everything related to vaccines and cocktail, like the antibodies and stuff, is all based on those two, or but that's irrelevant at the moment.
Great. So we just have another question in the chat, which is, does the Pfizer vaccine contain deactivated viruses / mRNA that is directly acquired from aborted cells, or was the initial research done using aborted fetal cells?
No. So what scientists have very cleverly done is that they've so a virus contains protein, right? And the key to developing a vaccine is identifying that protein. And proteins are made using a code. It's like a recipe book, and that recipe is contained within the mRNA. M stands for messenger. So what scientists have got is they've got that recipe that makes this protein. And using that recipe, all they are doing is you don't need the virus. You don't even need the protein that makes the body recognize the virus. All you need is the recipe for the protein. So let's take the example of a bank robber, right? A traditional vaccine which uses a weakened version of the virus would be like you bring a robber in handcuffs to a bank and saying, this guy is a bad guy. Look at his face so that you recognize him the next time. Don't let him in. He's a robber. So the guy is still there, but he's weakened. He's handcuffed. What an mRNA vaccine would be the equivalent of just handing him a picture. This is just a picture of the guy. This is a bank robber. This is what he looks like. He's not here. You're in no danger from him. This is just a picture of him. So off you go. And so it's like the vaccine is injecting a recipe for the photograph. So the recipe goes into your cells, and your cell develops a photograph, and then your body and your immune system looks at that photograph and is like, oh, hang on, virus. It's really quite clever. So some vaccines send in the photograph, some vaccines send in the virus, mRNA vaccines send in the recipe for the photograph. So there is nothing to do with the viruses there, because the recipe is just a code, and that code, that mRNA is synthesized in a lab. It doesn't need to be grown in any cells or anything. So no cells are used in the development. But in the testing phase, they have to inject this mRNA into something, right? Into cells to see does it work. In the testing phase, they used cells, and those cells are the problematic cells in both the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine.
So you can't get, a lot of people are worried that you need get COVID to get the vaccine. But because there's no virus in the Pfizer vaccine.
Jennifer, sorry, Jennifer, it's really hard to hear you there. It's really distorted.
While Jennifer's setting up, I think just one more point to make that maybe a lot of people don't realize is that we do not have information yet We don't have evidence or data yet whether taking the vaccine prevents you from transmitting the virus to others. So we don't know that yet. So I think that's another important thing to consider, because people say, you mightn't take the vaccine for yourself, but take the vaccine for others, for who can't get vaccinated. But we don't know if that is true. That may still be true. I would rather err on the side of caution and say, look, in case it does also stop me from transmitting to other people, I would still take it. But that's just something to remember. We don't know. For all we know, you could get the vaccine and you won't get the bad effects of the COVID disease, but you could still have the viruses and still be passing it on to others. We don't know that yet.
One more question. Why does it matter if you have an objection to it when the option of taking the vaccine and not taking the vaccine doesn't change what happened in the past, nor does it change what happens in the future? Because it doesn't change the number of abortions that happen.
Yeah, I think the main thing over there, I would say, is that abortion is abortion. Like, what happened did happen. And then I think Nikhil explained it over there in terms of how involved you could be. It's ultimately a person's own conscience, in the sense, like, yeah, you didn't do it, but it did happen. And if you, by taking the vaccine, is in some way not explicitly saying that, yes, this is good, but in some way encouraging them, like that, okay, we never need, like, for the company to be thinking, oh, we never need to bother about aborted babies or taking their cell lines, like. So
Yeah,
I
wouldn't
would say something around that. Yeah, I that's what I think anyway.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it doesn't affect anything in the future, because I think the actions or lack of action on behalf of people in the population speaks volumes about what will be done or what will be considered acceptable for future research. So if you do have an objection to it, it does affect the future by speaking up, because it provides a market and incentive for people, for pharmaceutical companies to go and look for ethical alternatives.
I think it's also, sorry, go ahead.
No, but whether it changes the past, it's about, like, if I start glorifying Hitler now, if I start saying, Hitler is great, I don't see what the issue is. You can see that I could say, like, all the Jews that he killed are still dead. Hitler's dead. What difference does that make? But there's an endorsement of the evil that Hitler did there, right? I think that's maybe somewhat gets to the point that I'm trying to make here. Joseph, I don't know if that answered your question.
I think also, like, when we actually actively take it, without any objection to what has happened, it's almost like saying, yeah, you guys can go ahead and do more research on these cells. Don't look for alternatives, because we don't care about alternatives. Like, so more research will be done on these cell lines itself, instead of actually finding other types of cell lines that could, they might stumble upon some other immortal cell line, but that's not from aborted fetal cell lines. So it's like saying, yeah, go ahead, use these, continue to use this, don't look for alternatives. For the pharma companies and research scientists, basically.
Okay, but, like, say if you still do continue, it still doesn't change the number of abortions that happen. So it's virtually this, it stays the same virtually. Whereas, like, if you, like, in the analogy used against Hitler, like, if you glorify Hitler, and then obviously, as we can see with far-right movements now, like, you can, that can affect the future in a sense that you can end up making another movement and causing hate crimes and whatnot that affect other people. This is kind of more isolated than that.
Sorry, I just wanted to say, like, with that, the thing I was just thinking was, it's kind of like when people have a moral objection to anything, where a lot of the world is following something and you have a moral objection to it, and it doesn't necessarily change what's happened. So There are people that are against the killing of animals for meat, but you can't say, oh, I mean, the chicken's dead already, so I mean, I might as well eat it. And it's the idea that when people reduce their consumption of it, or if people are resisting that, eventually the companies that contribute to this will lower what they're doing or reduce what they're doing. Yeah.
See, that's another false equivalency, because you see, when you say the chicken's already dead, and then you keep eating the chicken, that creates more demand for more chickens to be killed. Whereas in this case, more fetuses aren't killed.
More fetuses aren't killed necessarily as a direct consequence, but it's a step in the direction of saying there isn't anything ethically problematic with the using of aborted cell lines. Isn't that a step? So I know if you're looking for like direct sequential proof that A is going to cause B, it'll be hard to find it. But ideas have consequences. So if you want to look at some of the greatest philosophies that govern the minds of the 21st century population, be it individuality or freedom as the ultimate ethic, or whatever these are, you can trace these ideas back through the ages to some of the most key philosophers or thinkers of the preceding centuries. You're thinking back to maybe Nietzsche or Sartre or Karl Marx, this idea of freedom or oppressor versus oppression. You can see traces of that in the modern victim mentality or my safe space and all those kind of things. Point being made is, I'm sure when Karl Marx espoused his ideas about, revolution being the way of change and oppressor versus oppression mentality, he didn't predict the effect of the way it's going to shape the thinking of today. And yet it's the thinking of today that leads to actions of today, like activism or whatever movements and stuff that exist. Basically what I'm trying to say is, it's hard to argue with abstraction when you're saying, how can this one idea affect anything? But it is ideas that over time affect, change the thinking of a whole generation, that then filters down into policy, into incentives, into commerce, into legislation and things like that. So it's important to clarify the morality of ideas and to object when wrong ideas are propagated, to prevent those future consequences that then manifest itself as actions.
Wouldn't that be in a way that's kind of like a slippery slope fallacy?
Right. Okay. Go on. That's there need not always be a slippery slope. Just because A led to B doesn't mean that B always has to lead to C. Is that the slippery slope fallacy?
Yeah.
Why? What makes us think that this is an example of a slippery slope fallacy? I mean,
well,
how would you say that?
Things happen in sequences. So obviously there's not going to be this step happens and then the next step would be this directly as a consequence influences let's say, what is it? It promotes more fetuses being killed for scientific research. I'm sure there's steps in the middle of that happen between the current step we're in right now and that end step that we're discussing.
Sorry, Joseph, I didn't understand the point. Could you say that again?
So it doesn't all happen in one step.
No.
Even with Karl Marx's ideology, a lot of things have to happen in the middle to get to where we are right now.
Sure.
So what I'm saying is that there's other stuff, there's stuff that happens in the middle that you have to come to as well. Just because you start from the start doesn't mean you get to the end immediately. There's stuff that happens in the middle as well that you discuss along the way.
Agreed. I'm not saying
I would agree in the sense that even what the church has developed and the documents that the church has put out at the moment kind of reflects those, so that it doesn't go a slippery slope all the way, where it isn't questioned. And I think those 6 points that Nikhil made in that document, like you can see how, like, in the church's wisdom, like how she is kind of explaining it out, like on where it is. She's not saying, like, with the grave danger that we're all facing at the moment, she's not saying, okay, no, yeah, you all can not take the vaccine. Like, she is saying, yeah, no, you can take the vaccine, but remembering all of these things also, like, and
no, I don't have a problem with any of that. It's just the initial question of why
Yeah,
would someone have a
Joseph was wondering
objection?
why do some people have an objection to this at all? Because it's something that happened in the past. And yeah, maybe we can discuss
I think
that.
it's also something that's, well, I don't know if, again, if this is going to be something you'll accept as similar, but if there was a building or a monument that was created by slaves, for example, it just depends on your morality. There'll be people that say, I don't want anything to do with it. I'm not going to visit it. I don't even want to look at it because in the past this happened. And it's not like you visiting it is going to contribute to more slaves being used to create it. It happened in the past and that time has passed. And it's not likely to come again, but there's still people that would go, that's part of the history that I'm not happy with, and I don't want to take any part in it. So maybe that's a little bit more similar.
Yeah, and that it represents a certain ideology, a certain way of thinking, and by cooperating in that, at least even implicitly, I'm endorsing that ideology. Likewise, the problem at the root of this is the fact that a human being, the dignity of a human being should never be compromised. A human being cannot be treated as a commodity, which is the same objection at the root of sex trafficking, child slavery, child pornography, slavery, pornography, any of that. A human being cannot be treated as a commodity. That is the idea or the ideology that is being attacked when human beings are commodified. And that is the thing that ought to be kind of resisted or condemned at the very beginning. I think that's at the heart of the objection that people have. It's a thin end of a wedge that has more visible things at the other end. But this is thin edge. It begins with a rejection of an ideology.
Well, again,
I think just one more thing there. What Alvin was saying about, okay, there's a monument that's kind of built by slaves and we visit it, but that doesn't mean we partake in that act, or we aren't actually gonna keep the slaves or anything like that. But in this case, when we actually take it without any objection to it, we're actually endorsing it again as like, yes, this research can continue for other kind of scientific kind of discoveries as well. We're actively encouraging it. We are not actually telling them, go and find another alternative method.
Yeah.
So we're not, like, it's just doesn't, like, what has happened in the past is wrong. And we're encouraging it actively.
Yes. So I'm sorry, Joseph. I had to cut you off there a bit now because we have other questions that people are asking, just so that we all get a fair chance to it. So
yeah,
I hope you're okay with that though.
Yeah.
So just there was another question that one of the other participants posed, which was, so first one is so there is so I don't know to what extent this is correct, but I read that church allows abortion if the pregnancy poses a risk to the life of the mother. If that was the case of these two abortions, wouldn't these vaccines be ethically acceptable? As long as there aren't any documentation to say otherwise, one can't be fully sure if it was unethically sourced. So that's the
Can you just maybe quickly read that once again?
Yeah. So because so church allows abortion if the pregnancy poses a risk to the life of the mother, right?
So first of all, can I stop you that's incorrect. So the definition of abortion is a willful, intentional killing of a fetus, of a human baby. If there is a risk to the life of the mother and the child dies as a consequence of an emergency, be it a medical procedure or as an intervention or whatever, the intention there is a saving of the mother. The intention is not the killing of the child. So that isn't abortion. Or even if you want to, you can call it abortion if you want. You can call it whatever name you want to call it, but that isn't what the general pro-life community or the church understands by abortion. So that that's the principle of double effect. If you're trying to achieve a good and a negative or an evil comes out of it, and that evil isn't your intention, that happens in life.
Yeah. So,
Anyway,
so the next part of the thing is basically, what if these two aborted fetuses that that we trace back to, where you know were of such case where it was they were not aborted, but
oh
they
yeah,
were.
would that be ethical then? I get your question. Well, they
Yeah.
weren't. One of the fetuses were aborted for psychiatric reasons, and the other one, I can't remember. But it wasn't that they were trying to save the mother's life and the child died as a process. No, they were abortions. They were intentional killing of the baby.
Okay, so this is a different question from a different participant. So you mentioned in your talk that many vaccines use these fetus cell lines, more not just the COVID vaccine, but many of the vaccines that we have in the world does use them. So, um, you know, should we then be avoiding all these vaccines, or what will be
Yeah.
your thoughts
So
to that?
the key there is what they said about grave danger. So when the rubella is called German measles as well, it was claiming the lives of, do I want to say 10,000s or millions of many, many children. So when the parent is faced with the option of, as we said, a remote material cooperation with the initial evil that took place in the 1960s versus the good of saving the life of my child in front of me, you can see what way it weighs. You can see why it would be morally permissible to do that. Because on the one hand, I would be permitting the child to die here versus a remote cooperation with evil. So that is a grave situation where this rubella, we've no cure for it, and there's people dying left, right, and center because of it. That poses a grave danger, and that tips the balance. So it has to be taken
Case by case.
I don't want to say case by case, don't make it kind of sound subjective, but has to be taken with a consideration of the other factors as well.
Factors involved in it. Great. So now this is another question from another participant. So it's one thing taking the vaccines ourselves if we don't have a moral objection, but should we be actively promoting to people without explaining the moral aspect as well? So it's just one thing, taking the vaccine, but should we be promoting it to people without explaining the moral aspects as well, just as you did today with us?
Do people have thoughts?
I don't know. Does it depend on who you're talking to? Like, if you're, let's say, if we're talking to another, maybe like as we mentioned, another Catholic or another pro-lifer, or maybe someone who does consider morality of vaccines or ethics of vaccines in general, versus someone who doesn't. I don't know, who's never given any thought to it. I guess it would depend on who you're talking to.
I would say that it's an opportunity to even kind
It
of,
is an opportunity, yeah.
to kind of even speak about all of this. Like, so I would say to everyone, it shouldn't be limited to any single person. Like, if you know the morality of it, and if you understand like how it can and what the potential of it is, definitely
Yeah.
it's a great opportunity to kind of explain it and to say even in a way, like it's even the one that we have with the Pfizer one is even more better than, well, not saying that it is better, but like comparatively to the AstraZeneca, which is most likely to be coming over here in the next 2 or 3 weeks, like, it'll be an opportunity to kind of even explain like what's the difference, like, because most people wouldn't know that, like.
Or even if you don't know the facts behind it, even just educating people, or maybe like telling someone that some people have a concern, or I have a concern about this because it uses abortion type cell lines. Even just saying that much, so they can then maybe go and look it up.
Yeah. So the key thing
I'd
is,
say especially, hopefully we have a choice, like when all the other vaccines become authorized, become approved by the European Medicines Agency, and then authorized for distribution and use, clinical use. Hopefully we have a choice in which vaccine we're allowed to receive, should we go to receive a vaccine. But we're not guaranteed that we will have a choice. That's what the the CDF, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith letter or statement says, like we might not have a choice. But if we do, then I guess it would be, like Georgia said, a really good chance to, like, a really good opportunity to at least advise people who are going to get the vaccine to, you know, consider a more appropriate, a slightly better alternative to the likes of the ones that use the actual fetal cell lines in their production.
Great. So, yeah. So with that, so with that question, guys, we're coming close to our time. We're way well beyond our time. We were supposed to roughly close up around that, 10 minutes ago, even with including the Q&A. But it was really, really fantastic to, listening, even this aspect of the morality of the
Uh,
vaccine. Yeah, Nikhil, you're trying to
Harsha,
say
sorry,
something?
can I just make a couple of just a very quick few points,
Oh, yeah,
because we
indeed.
did not cover any of the safety or any of that kind of stuff. So just to make a couple of points, you don't have to. Oh yeah, I'm not screen sharing, am I?
No, no.
One is the fact that we don't know. So if you're considering, if you're somebody who's thinking that, okay, look, I don't want anything to do with this, maybe the only reason I'd consider taking this is because I don't want to put somebody else at risk, because there are certain people who mightn't be able to get the vaccine for whatever medical reasons or whatever. It's important to remember that while it may be that when you get vaccinated, you will no longer be able to infect somebody else, that may be the case, that may not be the case. We don't have the evidence. We don't know yet. One thing to remember. Secondly, pregnancy, as some people had questioned, we don't have. So pregnant, like specifically pregnant women were not tested, so we do not have enough safety or efficacy data to see is it safe or is it any less safe or any more or less effective in pregnant ladies. Studies are still ongoing. Um, so some people would say that one thing we do know for sure is that pregnant women, when they get COVID, have a worse course of illness. Their symptoms are more severe and they tend to do worse. And they have an increased risk of adverse outcomes once they get COVID. So you could make the case that they are a net risk group, they should get it. But then there's the thing of we don't know about the safety profile of it. So that's one thing to bear in mind. Maybe the third thing is that the mRNA vaccines, they will not alter the DNA. mRNA is something, you're not going to grow extra organs or limbs or anything. It doesn't enter the nucleus. It's something that's very quickly broken down inside the cell. It doesn't get into the nucleus where your DNA lives. It lives outside the nucleus in the cell for maybe a few hours to maybe a day or two. And the last thing maybe is to remember that even post-vaccination, even if you've had COVID, they recommend getting the vaccine. And post-vaccination, you should still continue to wear masks and hand hygiene, etc. Because, as we said, we don't know. You could still be infectious to other people. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, with pregnancy though, they are it isn't like they did come out initially and say like it's not recommended. A lot of medicines are not recommended in pregnancy because we don't have enough evidence on their safety, and because of the fact that they recognize, yes, there is the unborn child, so you know we don't know what the outcome for the child would be. But they are generally vaccines though, because you know there are cases where pregnant women need vaccines. Like definitely you need the flu vaccine every year, especially if you're working in healthcare. You also need the whooping cough vaccine in pregnancy. These are the two standard vaccines that you'd get during pregnancy. But with COVID, they've said that so this is the recent advice that's come out from the obstetricians and gynecologists in Ireland and also in the UK. Different countries have kind of differing advice, but they are saying that if pregnant women choose to receive the vaccine, they can with the consent of their obsgyn, so their healthcare provider, their obstetrician, and it's going to be between 14 and 33 weeks. So not from conception to 14 weeks, because that's a period where spontaneous miscarriages is very likely, highly likely, and not after 33 weeks because it's so close to term. So they avoid giving vaccines or certain medications during that time. So yeah, they are actually recommending, or not recommending, but permitting pregnant women to receive the COVID-19 vaccine if they desire between 14 and 33 weeks. But yeah, still there is going to be, like, these vaccines are so new, and with all medicines, they're going to be, their safety profile is, and their efficacy as well, is going to be monitored after the vaccine has been given to patients, to people. So it's not like the pharma companies are just going to like stop, and the regulatory authority, it's not like they're going to just let the vaccine just be given and then just wait for side effects to be reported. Well, that is part of it, but they are actively monitoring as well because so much is unknown about it.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for
Just
taking.
to clarify there, that shouldn't give the impression that we don't have efficacy data on it. It's
Yeah.
just that specifically pregnant women haven't been tested. Anyone 16 years and older, we've got really good efficacy data, safety data on
Yeah,
it.
it's like
which is a safe vaccine.
95% effective, which is more effective than the flu vaccine that we have every year, more effective than a lot of vaccines actually. So the efficacy rate is quite high for the Pfizer vaccine.
Great. Is there anything else you want to add, Nikhil, or is that yeah?
No, I just wanted to say just about the safety data. Like, it's the
Pharmaceutical
I
production.
think Jennifer. No, it's okay. Jennifer already mentioned it, but it's not like any medicine will have. Oh, I don't have to highlight it. Okay, it's not like any medicine will have no side effects or no like adverse reactions. Like, there are news and stuff that going around. People have died from taking the vaccine and stuff like that. But like, it is not. I'm not because it is expected. But people just react differently to vaccines. So in very rare cases, people might really adversely react to a vaccine. But having said that, the numbers or the proportions are so low. Like,
That
it'll
would
be
be the equivalent of boycotting peanuts because some people have allergic reactions to peanuts.
exactly, like, people die from a lot of things. Like, people die from eating like any sort of natural food. Like, and food, like, so it's not that the safety data is not being done. It's actually been conducted very severely. It's just the long-term safety data hasn't been published because it hasn't been long-term yet. Also, a lot of people have concerns about the speed at which the vaccine is created. So people are saying normally vaccines take more than 8 or 10 years at least, to get approved from the clinical trials to the final phase. But obviously, because of the situation, it has been fast tracked. But that doesn't mean people haven't been prepared for it. Like, it's very similar to the SARS, the actual COVID virus is very similar to a lot of other viruses. So they already have a starting point. It's not like COVID is a completely new thing where they have to start from scratch. Like, also, since Ebola was also a pandemic, we don't talk about it much because it hasn't affected the Western world as much. But Ebola, since then, scientists have been prepared. Like, more technology advances, the more scientists are prepared to actually combat pandemics like this. So people have been, especially since the pandemic, this has been the number one priority. All the regulatory authorities have given them number one priority, and so that's why the speed of the vaccine has been here so quickly. Not because it's been taking shortcuts, but it's more so about the priority of it. I know this is not the discussion of today, but I just want to add because we're talking about the safety of it.
Yeah. So yes, guys, with that, and I do thank everyone who stayed till this late as well, and it was great and very informative. And Nikhil, thank you so much for putting it very simply in a manner that we can all understand, and for explaining different aspects of it.